Starting out like all my other videos, we're going to start with the zenithal highlight. The highlighting is a form of pre-shading that helps guide where the highlights and shadows will appear on a model before applying full color. I like to start all of my skin tones out with a base of magenta, so I use Warlord Purple, and I thin that 50-50 with water and airbrush it all over the parts where the white highlights are. After that, I take either red ink, or in this case a Blood Angel's red, any really highly saturated red will do, and I spray that into all the dark areas, shadows, and the recesses of the model. And this helps start setting up the colors for the skin tones underneath. Once both of those are done, we're going to move into using Burned Flesh. This is a color out of the Fairy Flesh set by Vallejo, and it's quite a dark skin tone. I thinned that 50-50 with water, and I sprayed it over all of the skin area, both the highlights and the shadows. The key with this color and every other color that comes after is you don't want to cover up the layer below it entirely. You want some of that to still show through some of that color. So once we finish with that color, we move on to Base Flesh, which also came out of the Fairy Flesh set by Vallejo. And again, thin it 50-50, and I just spray it over the whole thing, both the highlight areas and the darker areas. After that, we're going to use a Sunny Skin Tone, and we're going to do the same process as we did with the last two colors. Once that's done, I used Army Painter Nomad Flash with 1 drop of red ink to give it a little more pink, and I shot that up around the areas where there's folds in the skin, up underneath, behind the knees, that kind of thing. And then I moved on to Rosy Flesh from Vallejo, and I thinned that down 50-50, and I sprayed that over the whole thing. From there, I took a basic skin tone and I used it just on the highlighted parts of the skin, so just the parts where the light would be most concentrated. And then I took Citadel Gilliman Flesh and airbrush that up into all the shadows and recesses. At this point, some of the areas are looking a bit desaturated, so I took a Cardboard Crimson shade, and it'll bring back some of the really darker pinks if you spray that all into the shadows. And then once all that's done, I just took a thin down yellow ink and I sprayed it over the whole areas, both the lights and the dark areas, and that brings a little bit more color back to the flesh. Moving on, you can see I'm using Anthracite Gray to paint the base of the rocks here. And I just covered the whole thing. You don't have to be very careful here. I just slapped it on with an old brush. When you're doing rocks, you can use any grays really to start with, or any browns or anything like that, depending on the type of rock you want to do. I just use the colors typically that I always use with rocks because that's what I'm comfortable using. But you can mix it up. So you can see I'm using some colors like terracotta and burnt umber and yellow ochre, and I'm putting spots of it all over the rock, and it starts to look really disgusting at this point. You're starting to think maybe I'm ruining the way this looks, but you just trust the process here. I mix up a batch of black wash, which is a really watered down black paint, and then you spread that over everything and dab up any of the excess to begin with, and then you dry that off. And then you keep applying coats of that black wash until you get something that looks very much like rocks. So it takes sometimes 3 or 4 coats before you end up covering up a lot of that color you added on there. After you get a color that you're happy with after a few coats of washes, then you can take a lighter color. I use Stone Gray here, but you can use any lighter color than what you've got. And you dry brush all of the highlighted areas of the rocks here, catch all the sharp edges. And once that's done, you'll take a much lighter color like white or an off-white or an ivory, and you'll just hit the very tips of those rocks. Anybody could just stop here and you would have a perfectly good looking rock base. But I wanted to add a little bit something extra to this model where I found the base to be a little bit plain looking. So I've got some snow and ice products here I'm going to try out for the first time, starting with the Woodland Scenics Soft Flake Snow and AK Ice Sparkles. And what I'm going to do is use a matte Mod Podge to put that into place. So I just mixed up, put a little bit of that matte Mod Podge onto a piece of scrap there, and brush that on with an old brush in a couple spots where I wanted to put the snow buildup. And once you had that put there, I took some of that flake snow and put it into a little spice shaker, just so I had a little more control over it. And I just started putting that all over where the glued areas were, and that's going to put a bit of buildup of snow. I think the key here is just to do a little bit at a time because you don't want it to look unnatural. So I just did a little bit and let it dry, and then did a little bit more. What I'm doing here is I'm going to do the ice sparkles around where the feet go into the base. And the ice sparkles do a really good job of making it look like it's kind of like a little bit of like melted snow. So if she was standing still, say, and there might be some heat coming off her feet or her boots, it might look a little bit different where it's starting to melt that snow. So that's what I did around her feet area. The good part about using the matte Mod Podge, or if you're using gloss Mod Podge, is that it dries really clear, so it's not going to leave any white residue behind. So what I'm doing here is I'm going back in and adding more snow. I wasn't quite happy with the amount that I did the first time, and so I'm just adding a bit more of that glue and a bit more of those snow products in and around those areas to have just a little bit of buildup. You want it to look natural, so you don't want it to be all the same amount in all the same areas of the rock. And then I went back in one last time and added a few more ice sparkles around that foot area, so it looked like maybe she was like stepping into the snow. And then after that, I used some UV resin and I mixed it with a little bit of blue and green alcohol ink, and I put it into that recess on the base. And you can see I'm just moving it around here with an old popsicle stick or coffee stir stick. With this stuff, you really have to do it in really thin layers. I think 3mm is what they recommend to be the deepest layer at a time. So this took quite a few layers to build up, and what I want to do is put a base of that blue-green resin down first to simulate that color of water flowing through the rocks there. And then later I ended up going back and adding a whole bunch of different layers of just clear resin on top of that. And moving on to the boots, I used red leather, which is always a good start to a leather boot, and airbrush that over the whole thing, and then used a Agrax Earth Shade and airbrush that up into the shadows and recesses of the boots, and then an AK Cork color to hit all the highlights from the top. And I only showed it on one boot there, but it's the same process for two. And then I used a Vallejo Deep Sea Green, which is it's a gray, but it's kind of greeny, but it's mostly gray. And I used that color to paint the leather laces or whatever they are wrapped up around her boots there, just to differentiate them, I guess, a bit from the leather color. Once that was done, I took Rhinox hide, which is just a darker brown. It's a really nice brown for leather or anything like that. And I did the soles of the boots with that brown. Moving on to the fur on the boots, I just used Vallejo Deck Tan, which I use in all of my painting sessions, it seems. And it's just a really nice off-white color. And I just covered a couple of coats of the fur with that Deck Tan color. And once I finished with that, I took it over to the airbrush booth and used a Skeleton Horde contrast paint to spray up into the shadows of that fur just to give it a little more definition. Moving to the midsection, I used Cygor Brown and painted the leather flaps there on the front and back with that color. And then I'm going to come in and use a couple other browns there for the rest of them. So I use a snake bite leather for a couple of the other straps, and then a red leather and a rhinox hide for some of the belt areas. And then for the highlighted areas like the buckles and the metal parts, I used Pro Acryl dark silver color, which is really nice. That toothpick that's there is just to keep the strap off of the skin tone so I don't accidentally get any paint on the legs. And it's a pretty hard thing to correct if you mess that up. From there, I used Pro Acryl bronze, and I painted all of the coins that are on a string hanging off her belt. Again, it's a really nice bronze color. I use that all the time. Moving on to her chest piece, I used rhinox hide again, and I did her top there. I guess that's a top. And I also used that same color to do a couple of the straps going across her chest and around her hips. Just while I'm working through that, now's a pretty good time to tell you a little bit about this model. It came out of recent month from CA3D Studios Patreon that I pay for with my own money. I think it's an excellent deal. They release 8 or 9 or more really nice looking models every single month for a really great price. So if you're into painting these kinds of models and you've got a 3D printer, I highly recommend checking them out. This particular model was sculpted by Daniel Mudatsos. Anytime you've got an area of a model where it's got, say, like multiple different types of leather, wherever you can, it's best to try to use slightly different shades. Sometimes I'll take the same shade of color and add a little bit of red or a little bit of tan color into it, and that just sort of mixes it up just a little bit, so it gives a little bit of interest for your eyes. And then there's a little piece of like a metal buckle on the chest piece, and I just used that Pro Acryl bronze to paint that as well. And then using deck tan, I went around the fur areas of the top, and there's also some trim on the upper part of her top there that I used the Pro Acryl bronze for as well. Whenever you've got small trim work, I always use a small brush, and I take off most of the paint on the back of a glove or something, and then I just use the side of the brush to get into the small areas so you don't have any paint getting anywhere you don't want it. Then I used that dark sea green again to do one of her fur on one of her cuffs there, and used a snakebite leather for the leather part of that, and I used 2 coats of that. On her other arm, she's got some leather straps around her wrists, so I used cavalry brown for that, just to mix up the color a little bit so I wasn't using the same colors of leather on everything, because I thought she'd be sort of mixing and matching her leathers as most Vikings or barbarians probably did. They probably weren't too concerned with aesthetics, maybe more concerned with looking like a Viking or a barbarian, I guess. I didn't want to continue using the same colors for the fur. I wanted to mix it up a little bit. So for the big pelt around her back, I used a Pro Acryl black-brown for that. And then I dry brushed a copper over that. It's a little trick I picked up a while ago. Anytime you're doing any type of like brown hair or brown fur, if you dry brush it with copper, your eyes don't really see copper. They see like that light brown color. Anyway, it works out really well. So give it a try and see if you like it. She's got some bone accents on her top piece here. So the skull, I just painted with a Pro Acryl ivory. And then I brushed the whole thing after that with that Citadel contrast skeleton horde to get up all into the recesses and make it look like a bit of aged bone there. And once all that's done, you can take a lighter color. I used stone gray here, and I just dry brushed it over that piece. Now she's also got another piece of bone here. It's more like a ram's horn or something like that on her other shoulder. So I just used a yellow ochre that burnt umber color. I used these colors in the rock earlier, and an off-white. And I just started mixing those colors up, starting with light and just working my way by adding washes and shades and dry brushing highlights. The good part about bones and stuff like that when you're painting them is they don't really need to be a particular color, so you can just play around with what you've got until you're happy with how it looks. You know, depending on how old or dirty the bones are, you might take a different approach and put more darker shades onto that, or more highlights if it's like a fresh bone color. And then I just took the skeleton horde again and just put that on the leather strap that goes around that ram's horn. Moving on to the eyes, I always start out my eyes the same way. I take the Vallejo model color black and color the whole eye area with that, and then use a squid pink over top of that. And then after that squid pink is dry, I used Pro Acryl Ivory. You could use Deck Tan or any other off-white color. You just don't want to use a pure white color. It will look completely unnatural. The key with the eyes or anything that's this kind of smaller detail is just use a small brush and make sure your paints are thinned out really well, but not too well. And then you can just be really careful when you're applying it so you don't have any overages. And then I used a Magos purple to cover the lips there. And then once the lips were done, she's also got a scar on her lips, so I used a reddish flesh color and watered it down a little bit, and just applied that where the scar tissue was to make it a slightly redder skin color. From there, I used gloss varnish, decal fix, decal softener. I'm just getting ready to apply the decals, the water slide decals for the eyes, like I did with some of my previous models. I cover the eyes and lips both with that gloss varnish just to give them a bit of shine. And then I use the decal fix and let that dry, and then I apply the water slide decals to the eyes, make sure they're in the right position, and then put a coat of decal softener over top of that to help them can take the same shape as the model there. I then used snakebite leather and that Pro Acryl bronze again, and I did the band across her forehead with the metal centerpiece there. Moving on to her hair, I covered all of it with a base coat of Hull Red, and then used an orange oxide to hit the highlights. And then I used really thin down medium orange to give it some a little bit of more orangey color. And then I used a Pro Acryl dark warm flesh and dry brush that over all of the highlighted strands of hair, and that gave a really nice kind of orangey, fiery red hair color. Big thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, make sure to subscribe so you're the first one to catch the next video. We're up to 46 subscribers, almost there to the 1 million mark. Please like and share this video with all your friends, and I'll see you next time.